We have been talking, speaking of travel, a lot about Cuba today and, this rollback of what Obama did by Donald Trump. Very interesting and so many different angles to this. We talked about what it means for Canadian travelers, and Elliot Finkelman said probably it doesn't mean cheaper trips right now, but what it does mean is fewer Americans in the next couple of years, if this is the way things are going, is that Cuba's not going to be inundated with Americans. So maybe, just maybe, the cost of trips won't go up. But what's interesting is, what does it mean for Canada? Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says it's going to be business as usual for Canada and Cuba, despite the fact we're seeing a renewed hardening of a relationship between Cuba and the U.S. Donald Trump here, when he was talking about why they're doing this, talked about having a free election, talking about human rights abuses, and really used that as the justification for this decision. We want to get Elliot Tepper's take on this now. He's a distinguished senior fellow with the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Christy.
Boy, there's a lot going on here. Is this a smart policy in your opinion?
Smart for whom? Yes, it's very smart for Donald Trump and his domestic constituency, which is the lens through which I think we should be viewing this. We have a beleaguered president, increasingly beleaguered president, and he increasingly, around many different issues, is moving to his base. He's trying to shore up the base, the people who brought him to the presidency, and when you take a look at his policies on the environment, on Paris, and a number of other issues, on NATO even, you can say that what he's doing is, in a sense, closing the ranks. Any attempt to say that he's a changed president, he's beleaguered, he needs his base, he's going to the base. The Miami vote, the Florida vote, but in particular Miami, he feels really swung it for him narrowly in the last election, and he's going back to reinvigorate and to shore up what he needs right now.
Right. And you could see today, as he talked about this during his speech in Miami, people cheering, people really, really identifying and enjoying what he had to say as he was complaining about Cuba and talking about the fact that the government has far too long held political prisoners, that they've abused dissidents, and that they've restricted freedom of expression, which we know to be true. But, I do question really if that's the true reason he's doing this.
Well, it would be very good if everything he said today could be held up as the standard for him for his actions going forward, because he started out with exactly those statements, having just come back from Saudi Arabia, saying, I'm not here to lecture you. And if he suddenly has discovered human rights as the centerpiece of his foreign policy, and also in regard to Cuba, if all the things he's listed in regard to Cuba could come about, I think everyone in America and around the world, and most of Cuba, would be very pleased if that was the intention and if that's the outcome. However, we're not sure that's the intention, and it's almost certainly not going to be the outcome.
Well, as Evan pointed out, the usual host of Ottawa Now, we were just on, and he was saying, well, okay, that's all good and well, but here we've seen Trump traveling to Saudi Arabia,
exactly.
So is there really any consistency here?
No, I don't think we're seeing a sudden shift in American foreign policy announced with in this particular case, with the Cuban policy. You can also see this as a continuation, as everybody's pointed out, as essentially what the entire Republican apparatus has been about, which is undoing Obama. And undoing anything Obama did, let's go back to it. So I think that those are good framings for it. Beleaguered president shoring up his base, not a fundamental shift. That speech was actually Marco Rubio's talking points for quite a long time, and others around him. If we're speaking only of domestic American politics, it's unclear that this is really going to redound to his advantage in the next election, if that's the only thing we should be talking about, because even the Cuban-American community is now split because the younger people don't agree with their grandparents, and they want everybody wanted the opening, I think, except for a narrow and hardline base. So it's great to see him say these things about Cuba and about human rights, but really this seems to be primarily about domestic politics in Miami, in Florida.
Right. I just wonder, though, on the other side of things, Professor, if Cuba is really sitting up and paying attention here to this and listening earnestly, that, he's saying you have to release these prisoners, you have to
Yes.
really clean up your human rights record and change things moving forward. Otherwise, these sanctions are going to continue to exist. And that's the line that he's walking. I don't really know if they're listening. Do you think that this is going to have any impact on Cuba's behavior?
I think they're definitely listening. They've been signaling for a while. We know there might possibly be some changes coming. We're willing to talk to you. We're willing to renegotiate. But a senior official, we don't know who that is, in Cuba has said either the U.S. and Cuba will continue to normalize relations or not. And then he added, you cannot be half pregnant. So,
Okay.
So it's highly likely that the Cubans would be, first of all, taking a much closer look at what this policy means in material terms. For example, remittances are a big mainstay coming back from Cubans of American descent to Cuba. And if you're really interested in the private sector, well, those remittances have to continue. It's not clear to me today whether that's going to be affected by these announcements. But let's stand back and take a look at the bigger picture. If this is indeed going to be a message to the Cuban leadership, which is in transition. Remember, Raul Castro is almost as old as his brother and has already announced he's going to be leaving. If this throws back to the hardliners inside Cuba the message that we can't trust America, we thought we had an opening, we thought we had a deal, they're trying to press us, we're not going to do it. Who's the winner here? I can name three. First, all the competitors of America who are doing business in Cuba, they're going to say, fine, if you don't want to come in and do the business, and that includes Canadians if they're nimble, we'll be glad to fill the gap. But then there's the geopolitical implication. If Cuba is thrown back on its heels, and if this is not back to the future, but back is the future, going backwards, then the big winners, as usual, will be China and Russia, because the Cuban government, if it is forced back into some kind of a hostile relationship, will look to those allies.
What about Canada? I mentioned our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has already come out and has said it's business as usual for Canada and Cuba, despite what's going on between the U.S. and Cuba. Do you believe that?
Nothing's going to be normal when it comes to the Donald Trump administration and its policies. Will there be linkage made between what Canada does in Cuba and how America treats Canada, say, in NAFTA renegotiations and so forth? So we'll have to see if that kind of linkage is made. Certainly, if Americans are forced not to come into Cuba in the same way, then Canada, along with all other states, has an opportunity to outcompete. In a sense, it clears some space. But let's keep in mind that Canada and Cuba have had a long and deep relationship. Fidel Castro was one of the pallbearers at Pierre Elliott Trudeau's funeral in 2000. So this is a kind of deep connection. And, of course, all the Canadians and sunbirds and travelers and people who like to shop and tour, all of that has formed a human connection over a long period of time. And people-to-people contacts from America to Cuba specifically has been hindered by the Trump administration just now. Therefore, the people-to-people contacts by Canada and Cuba has, even more scope to grow.
Well, we appreciate your insight. Elliot Tepper, thank you for joining us.
Certainly, Christy.
That is Professor Elliot Tepper, Distinguished Senior Fellow with the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University.